Good morning or good afternoon. My name is Terry Irving, and welcome to Fall for the Book 2020. These free online events run from September through November. You can find the full schedule at fallforthebook.org, and be sure to follow us on crowdcast.io. Uh, for this story, you can search for the missing soldiers of the Vietnam War. Also do it by clicking on the Fall for the Book icon on your screen and click follow. I'm going to be asking your questions in just a minute. So feel free to hit the chat or ask a question icon on your screen, and they'll load up, and then we'll ask questions at the end. I had a great time being a guest at George Mason University in 2017, back when, I'm going to put this in front of me, back when people could appear in real life, as the editor of Yassusuni Hiroshiki's wonderful book on the journalists who covered the Vietnam War. And I'm proud to be here today with George Washington University Associate Professor of Anthropology, Sarah Wagner. Hello, Sarah.
Hello, good afternoon.
She is the author of What Remains, published by Harvard University Press, an in-depth study of the process of identifying those who have died in America's wars, and specifically Vietnam, and the effects that finding and memorializing the fallen has on American society. She has previously published books and articles on the process and social aspect of her work, identifying the primarily civilian war dead in Bosnia and Herzegovina, specifically the mass murder of some 8,000 civilians near the town of Srebrenica. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Terry. I'm glad to be here.
Okay, I'm going to admit that I was initially worried that I wouldn't like this book. I'm not a fan of anthropology. Distaste that goes back to 1972, when, as a graduate senior in sociology, the anthro professor who had to approve my final classes told me, "I don't think you should be allowed to graduate." I think that's reasonable. However, I found that What Remains, the book we're talking about, is a deeply personal and extremely well-written deep dive into how a nation memorializes its war dead, what lengths professionals will go to find, identify, and bring home those marked missing in action, even after 50 years have passed, and how this affects people on both a national and an extremely personal scale. I was particularly struck by the depth this book goes into, the technical process of identification, and in contrast, how Sarah also brings everything back to the small town, extremely personal level. Sarah, if you could kick this off by reading the beginning of the book, essentially.
I would be happy to do so. So the very opening of the book it's entitled Homecoming, and I'll just read the first 2 paragraphs. So, after 46 years, Lance Corporal Merlin Ray Allen came home. To fanfare and flags, he returned to the little town on the shores of Lake Superior, northern Wisconsin, where, as a child, he had spent his summer vacations and lived when his family moved north and finished out his high school years. He loved the lake and its sandy beaches, made good friends, and felt at home on the water. But in 1965, he also felt a duty to serve his country. A few months after his graduation from Bayfield High School, Allen enlisted in the Marine Corps to fight in Vietnam. And so we open with Allen and Allen's homecoming.
And you stay with it all the way through, which I was quite impressed with. Let's, I guess, jump to the end of Corporal Allen's story, and what happened to him.
Yeah, so this was a homecoming that had been delayed 46 years. And I wanted to begin the book with the ending because I wanted my readers to understand right away the power, the significance of the return of a fallen soldier, here a service member, to a community and particularly to a family. At the same time, signaling that return, that homecoming, brought all kinds of people gravitated all kinds of people to this event and to this place and to this memorial service at the high school. Others followed to the funeral service that actually took place on the shores of Lake Superior. And so this was like a gathering of people, some of whom knew Merlin Allen and some of whom had never known him, but they felt this need to come together and to mark this return. And the other thing that was probably unbeknownst to a lot of people who didn't know Merlin Allen or didn't know the story behind him, is that what returned was a single tooth. And so this was this incredible ritual activity that people came together for, and it made sense in the return of remains, but without actually knowing how very little of Merlin Ray Allen was able to be recovered and brought back. And that towards the end of the book, I really make an argument that meant to his family, nevertheless, no matter how partial or fragmented, it meant that he had come home.
Can you describe, in sort of not necessarily step by step, but I mean more or less the process by which this young man, my age, not that young, managed to get home?
Yeah, and the fact that you said this young man, and then you immediately said my age, the reason, I think it's really important, because so often these are people who are, they're not frozen in a negative sense, but they're fixed in our mind's eye, our memory, as this was a young life, right? This was a life cut short. So Merlin Allen's story is one of a recovery that took a long time. He was one of 5 individuals killed in a helicopter crash. And the US military spent decades trying to find the exact location of the crash, returned, different locations were sort of sussed out and then investigated. And eventually the proper site was determined, and I was part of a recovery team. And this was part of research into this larger project of how does the US military seek to recover, identify, and commemorate its missing in action from this war. And so in this case, I went with a team, an almost entirely military group. There was 1 civilian scientist, and our task was, for the course of 28 days, to excavate the purported, like the presumed crash site, and seek to find remains. And eventually we did. There were a total of 7 teeth recovered at that site, and then 3 or 4 tiny bits of bone. And out of that, within the first year, the remains were returned to the laboratory. This is a forensic scientific laboratory based in Hawaii. 2 individuals were identified. 1 tooth is associated definitively with one person, and a second with another person. And so I followed, of the 2 cases, I followed one back to northern Wisconsin. And I'm just going to little shout out, because I might have a couple folks from Bayfield or Red Cliff here, to the shores of Lake Superior. And I tried to understand what that return had meant to the family and the community. And it was...
No, that's okay. I'm going to go back there, but let me drop back a second. You sort of went right over what the process was of searching for the remnants. Okay. If I can, let me read a little bit of it. The excavation unit, the 4 by 4 meter patch of rust-colored earth, had taken all day to hollow out, and in the process had left each dig team, the pair of Americans who rotated in and out of the shallow trench for an hour apiece, drenched in sweat and physically spent. The temperature over 95 degrees and humidity well over 90%, the jungle seemed to be steaming. I mean, that is not what you think of when you hear anthropologist. At least it's not me. How was that? And then you really went out there and did it. I mean, you were digging.
Yeah, I was very fortunate. I should say it was unusual to be able to accompany a recovery team with the U.S. military to that site, in large part because I had worked in the laboratory doing research, and the scientific director said, if you really want to understand this process of accounting, you need to go on a dig. And so he sent me, the second year I was doing research at that lab, he sent me to it, along with this team. And right, so it's not, I will say, I think of myself, that you probably can't see it, I'm kind of a petite person, and I don't, I think of myself as kind of a tough person, but I am not physically, I'm certainly not an intimidating presence. And so getting there, it was a test of my physical limits and everyone's. If I have here in our viewers among you are some Vietnam veterans, nothing I'm describing there is unfamiliar to you. And I will say, it was a shock to my system. I'd never been to Southeast Asia. I'd never experienced that kind of the heat and humidity combined. And then this really arduous labor, which, as an anthropologist, we're supposed to be what we call participant observers, right? So I'm not supposed to be this person sitting on the side just watching it all. Like, the idea is that you're taking part in this process so you can understand it best. So
you really seem to gain a depth of understanding. I'm going to read another little bit.
Sure,
Like your book. This is as you were leaving, after you'd found the remains. The black pelican case that contains the 7 precious teeth, the 3 bits of bone, and the scraps of wreckage that constitute material evidence. It is the lightest and heaviest thing I've carried in or out of the site. It's our collective achievement resting in the grip of my hand. So, I mean, just emotionally, what was it like
it was
to know that you, among others, had found someone?
Yeah. It was a very intense experience, and I would say that intensity was both in that moment when we were finally leaving. The base camp had been broken down, and we were leaving and sort of hiking out with our gear. And that pelican case, that contained everything that we had labored over. And the fact, furthermore, we all had our suspicions that maybe this would lead to direct identification. So you knew that there was a possibility of unlocking, this, the unknown, what families had not had and been able to receive from the military, not just, knowing definitively where and how and what, but also getting remains back. And then I would say there was a similar moment when we found the first tooth. And so imagine this is a really steep mountain slope. You're churning through tons of soil, like bucket by bucket. It's being ferried up the slope up to the top of a mountain ridge, and we're using 1/4-inch mesh screens, right? So you dump the bucket of soil into the screen, and then you start sifting, and you're tossing out leaves and sticks and so on, and then you're really scrutinizing. And we did that over and over and over again. And and the whole dig is dependent on the Vietnamese laborers.
So I was going to ask
about. Be able to do it if they weren't helping us clear the land, and much of that physical labor. So I think all of us were like, well, day 8, day 9, we hadn't recovered. I mean, we were recovering scraps from the actual helicopter, but we didn't get remains. And then finally, there was it's just someone further down the screening station. There's a few of these screens, calls out, I got it. It's a tooth. And it was so obvious. I mean, it was so extraordinary because it was this perfect molar. And that was it. All of a sudden, everything switched, right? The morale, the sense of accomplishment. And then it was, let's see if we can find more.
I'm going to go now and switch to the town.
Cool.
What happened? What was it like when this Lance Corporal came home? And you describe also there's like 3 from the small area on the tip, the thumb of Lake Michigan, which I've never been to, but this homecoming it took over the town. I mean, it was not a small event.
Yeah. So one of the things I have to tell you is that I myself did not witness the homecoming.
But you witnessed another person.
I did, but let me explain what I think it's important to know this. In large part, as an anthropologist, I also think it's really important not to intrude on families' grief. And so this was not a moment for me as a journalist to drop in and see what the family thought. In fact, I waited a year. And I reached out to to Merlin Ray Allen's family, siblings. I placed a call to the local VFW post. And I also, when I worked through the Marine Corps casualty officer in order to kind of contact folks. And in that process, that's how I figured out that in Bayfield and Red Cliff, Wisconsin, there were 3 people who had been killed. It's a two small towns, right? And they had lost 3 people. And so when I finally did arrive there, I was incredibly lucky to be able to talk to one of the siblings right away from the Allen family, but also the brother of another killed in action but body not recovered. So that's often seen together as missing action. And that was Dwayne Soulier. And so his brother, Larry Booten Soulier, was another person who really helped me understand what the community had experienced the year before, but also the significance that that little VFW post is named after Dwayne Wutsy Soulier. And so it was immediately, I understood that this was a place that had been marked by not only service in the Vietnam War, but also loss.
I'm going to switch to another subject, which is you have the personal. And by the way, I think you should deserve great commendations for having spent a day on the water catching fish with.
That was the highlight.
Anyway, that would have killed me. But let's go from the personal to the national for a minute. At the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, where it says, "Here rests in honored glory an American soldier known but to God," and was established in World War I, where you say 50% of those missing were unknown. I mean, they just put unknown things on them. What happened to at the tomb where thousands of visitors, maybe millions, visit each year and look at the pomp and ceremony of a nation thanking its dead? And what happened? What was happened with the Vietnam soldier?
Yeah. That was really how I started this research in the beginning. I was really intrigued by the story of the identification of the Vietnam War unknown soldier. And we can talk about this a little bit later, but it connected back to my research that I'd done before in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So anyways, I was just so struck by, and it's considered the epicenter of American military commemoration. You've got Arlington National Cemetery, right, as the major national cemetery, and then Tomb of the Unknowns at its heart. And that, this nation had interrupted, right, had like disrupted that space, and that the tomb itself, right, the crypt, had opened it up and removed remains and identified remains. I recognized that was a major event, and I wanted to understand, anthropologically, what it meant. What was its significance at the time, and what did it mean going forward? And I pretty early on latched on to words of the Secretary of Defense, William Colin. So imagine that the remains were interred with, Reagan oversaw it. It was Memorial Day in 1984. And then it's in May 1998, 14 years later, these remains are removed. And then 6 weeks passes, and eventually the Department of Defense announces that the remains have been identified. And Cohen at the time, and I always think of it as maybe it was like a slightly off the cuff remark, but he was totally onto something. He was saying, it may be because of forensic science, because of these advances, and he was talking specifically about forensic genetics, right? The DNA testing. It may be that we may never have unknowns in any future war. And I knew at that moment whether he like exactly meant it like, here going forward, but I knew that this was a cultural milestone. And so what I wanted to understand is, well, how did that new exacting tool of DNA testing, how did it affect national commemoration going forward? And so, yeah, go ahead, Terry. Yeah.
No, but removed the remains of the Vietnam unknown soldier from the war in Vietnam. And in a way that's positive, that they found the person and they identified the family and they went, he returned and was buried in the military cemetery, I suppose, closest to his home and where his family can visit him. But on the other hand, I guess, I mean, from that time, you see the sort of, it's not pomp exactly, but reverence that they give to, World War One, the unknown, the World War II unknown, the Korean War unknown, and then there's an empty crypt for Vietnam, and just that, and there will be an empty crypt, I think, for Iraq or Afghanistan or any going forward. Does anyone feel that as a loss?
Yeah, I think there was at the time, right, in 1998, there was real debate about what did this mean, and was it a loss to the nation, or was it a gain for the family? And I you know, I think that kind of calculus is sometimes isn't so helpful, because it's hard. How could you possibly ask a family to give up their loved one to be unknown, right? Like that's an extraordinary. Haven't they sacrificed already so much? And does someone, when someone enlists or is fighting overseas, and is it the prospect, oh well, I'll be okay if my remains are never recovered and never brought home? I think that would be really unsettling. And so I, there's the symbolism that stays important, but I don't like to think of it as a gain or loss, or rather a change, right?
Change.
And that's like everything else in our world. Here we've got a cultural demand that we have a contract between our government, our state, and the military and their families, that this is what's owed. And this is not something that's new to Vietnam. It stretches all the way back to the Civil War, right? Repatriation and individual identification. So now we have, sharper tools in the toolkit, right? We've got this the forensic genetics, and combined with other lines of evidence, that we are able to identify remains if we are able to recover them. And that means that that the nature of this process is changing. I don't think that it means that the nation isn't able to lay claim and say, and this was important sacrifice. Nor does it mean that families they're left to their own devices. And one of the things that I open with also in the introduction is the scene of a family at a military funeral, the folded flag, right? That's handed. That symbol is the symbol of the nation, right? In gratitude for sacrifice.
Yeah, I actually wanted to read that section because I really liked it. Let me just, if you don't mind.
No, please, yeah.
The first time I watched a military burial at Arlington National Cemetery, I was riveted by the hands. The hands of the honor guard had all the mesmerizing, otherworldly energy of a burning fire. White gloves glided across clean edges, the flag suspended just above the wooden casket in a delicately choreographed motion. Fold after fold, the red, white, and blue receded into itself until all that remained was a tight triangular package, a gift from the nation presented on bended knee to the bereaved. First off, I got chills just now. That's not where anthropologists are supposed to talk. It's really good. But I mean, that reverence, not just at the end, but all the way through the process, it seems, and I'm described the digging process, and there's another. Maybe I'll ask you to read that or talk about it later. But I mean, the process of how these remains were treated, that they were, wrapped carefully in blankets, and they were, treated with reverence as they were tested and checked, and the difficulty of checking them was extreme. And it does seem that the country, I mean, the Vietnam veterans, and I have to say I was against the war, but the Vietnam veterans and their families felt, with reason, that they were forgotten. And it's odd that 50 years later they seem to be being remembered as.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, but if you're known, I guess that's the other side of the unknown soldier is you get the burial and the ceremony and the personal.
Yeah. And you come home to your family, and your family has a chance to care for you, and on their terms, in their own way. And maybe that means burying someone in a national cemetery, but maybe it means burying them in a family plot where grandparents are, right? But that's that choice that the family then gets. And for so many of families of the missing, and I can say that this was also true for Bosnia and Herzegovina, even though it's a very different context, as well as for the Vietnam families I worked with, that period of not knowing, it takes an extraordinary toll on people, right? All of the uncertainties and all of the what ifs that are part of a surviving relative's life, wondering, not only where is my loved one, but what would my life have been like if my brother was here by my side, or if my father had been, with me as I grew up and, entered adulthood, like those kinds of questions. And yeah, that was one thing that I was both impressed with. Not to say that these were exactly the same experiences, but they made sense to me from the work that I'd done in Bosnia. That gap, right? That loss, but it's a particular loss. It's this loss that's tainted by uncertainty, right? And so, early years in the war, you hold on to a hope. Maybe this person survived. And then eventually it's the hope of maybe I'll get remains back. When you're talking,
Let me, I guess, talk to you about, and I don't want to go off topic because there's the last two books, which you should bring in and do again. But Bosnia,
yeah,
and what was in there about Bosnia that isn't there about Vietnam? That is extra, extra, but different because of the nature of the war
yeah,
and the nature of what you were. And I can't even imagine what it was like to go through that.
yeah. So just really quickly, there's, Bosnia and Herzegovina, where I'd done the research and written a book about before. It was a case where the missing persons were civilians who had been killed in what is now called genocide. And so there's a real difference between a family member who lost a 12-year-old son to a genocidal attack, than a family member who, either saw their loved one go off as a draftee or an enlistee, or someone who, from the beginning of his military career, said, "This is what I want to do." So you have the category of a combatant versus, we'll say, a civilian victim of state-sponsored violence. And so these are really different experiences.
You also had a legal aspect in that if everybody on the side that did the shooting was saying, well, it didn't happen, prove it.
Right.
But that was what you were doing.
Yeah. So I think what the parallels I would say is that the forensic science kind of comes in as this tool. And I know, Terry, we talked a little bit about it. You're like, the forensic science is kind of the boring part. And I understand that.
He talks about it a lot. I have to say, anybody who's into science should read this book.
Well, what I wanted to make sure that people understood is that it doesn't happen like we kind of think, CSI, it's or Bones, or that it's a DNA testing and 12 hours later you have the results and it's definitive. It's a painstaking process, and it depends on a lot of different conditions in order to get at that identification. And so I think both cases, I learned a lot about the science, and I learned the importance of understanding the science so you can understand the effects, right? So that, for example, a family member can say, I trust the government, despite the fact that they sent my son off to a war I never wanted him to fight, or my father, and yet I trust that these are his remains, right? I believe with scientific certainty that this is, my relative. And without that trust, you can have the best evidence ever, but if family members don't see don't feel like the person who just told you it's my brother, then that whole process can fall apart. So that was also another side of it, both comparing Bosnia and the U.S. military's accounting, is that science depends on, the social context. It depends on trust.
Well, this actually leads us right into the first audience question.
Okay.
What was the emotional tone of the military personnel who were working with you as they uncovered the crash site? And you can probably take that along through the process. What does it mean to them that after so many years, one of their own is still being searched for?
Yeah. So I was so impressed with so I'll describe a little. We were 13 people, one civilian scientist who was part of what was then the Joint POW MIA Accounting Command, and 11 military personnel. And then I was this add-on forensic, well, I was a social anthropologist. They immediately thought I was a forensic anthropologist. And then once they discovered I wasn't a forensic anthropologist, they're like, you have relevant knowledge. So, but
what does that mean? You discovered you were not a.
Well, so I'm a social anthropologist, and that means that I'm not the scientist. I study the processes, but I am not a scientist. So I didn't really have I didn't have the archaeological knowledge or the forensic anthropological knowledge to help in any way. So that's why I really needed to earn my keep doing some digging right on the site itself. But what I want to say about the professionalism and the level of engagement was, I don't want to say, it's not that it surprised me. I was so impressed with it. And that, that went from the augmentee, someone who is not working this mission as a regular, but rather as someone brought in for, say, linguistic or communications expertise, all the way up to those who had been working with JPAC for over 2 years. And among them, probably my best interview, if I can say it that way, were with the two folks who had their specialization was mortuary affairs. And so I talked to them about what does it mean to be working on this mission versus what you were doing in Iraq or Afghanistan, or for that matter, on Dover Air Force Base. And they really helped me understand the connection for the current service member, that these painstaking efforts, right, these extraordinary resources that gave them some solace that the work they were doing and the work that they might expect to be done on their behalf. So they really helped me understand what that would mean to a current service member. I'm very grateful for their.
It does seem to me that you kind of got that feeling. I'm going to read something again. I can't help it. But when you were working as an intern in the mortuary lab in Hawaii, which is the primary one, and you're describing the early process of starting the identification process, and this was with a Korean War victim. Slowly, bone by bone, dipping toothbrushes and occasionally hands into the flowing water, we gently bathed and coaxed the powder off the skeleton. Its varied colors emerged, the effect of long-term contact with different elements, such as metal or soil, a darkened femur, coal black on one side, shades of brown on the other, rust-colored tones, light and dark for most of the other bones. After several minutes of careful labor, the layers of powdery dust that had protected the individual's remains for the last 60 years dissipated. I'm sorry, I mean, there is a aspect of love and reverence in that passage, which you felt.
Yeah,
I guess.
Absolutely. I think it was also, that was the first time I'd ever done anything like that. So I had been this observer, I would put on the latex gloves and the coat, and I would shadow the forensic anthropologist. And this is one of the instances where one of the anthropologists had a couple of interns and me assist in the process, knowing that it was good for all of us to learn how to do it with our hands. But because I had never done that before, right? I mean, I think the veteran forensic anthropologist is very used to handling remains. And for me, it was such a moment of sanctity, right? Because I saw the remains and I held them in my hand as someone's, right? Knowing that this was someone's loved one. And I think that not to say that forensic anthropologists don't have that connection, but it would be incredibly draining every day, day in, day out, to be having, emotionally sort of laying yourself bare as you're going through, case after case and remains after remains. So I think in some ways that passage is about, I'm going to use the term like a neophyte, someone who really is totally new to this and appreciating the sanctity of that moment. That is a scientific process, right? This is about cleaning and preparing remains so that they can be analyzed.
But it doesn't seem as though the the women who work there get um, inured to it, get used to it, make it. You talk about at the end they take the evidence that's been identified and wrap it in a green blanket, a green wool blanket. It's actually my family used to make. And it fastens it with 6 gold safety pins in an absolutely specific order, and so that it's returned in what seems to me a very loving way, oddly.
Yeah, I think it's loving, and I think it's about tradition, and it's a tradition that that connects, the missing or unidentified from World War One to World War Two. So it's the same type of blanket and same pins and order, so that it connects them. And in the same way, it also sort of levels them, right? So you can't tell when you see these are remains. Let's say remains that are recovered are wrapped in this blanket, pinned in this way, and then placed in a coffin. And there's a leveling at that moment before it goes into the coffin. And let's say the uniform that's bedecked with medals and so on, where you begin to see rank again. There's that moment before where there's a leveling, right? A leveling. You can't tell the branch. You don't know the person's age. It's a set of remains wrapped up in a traditional simple blanket and cared for in the exact same way. And I think there's a purpose there of showing the continuity, right? The continuity of experience and sacrifice.
All right, it's another audience question, and this leads to some things that you did deal with. With nearly 2,000 still unaccounted for, what are the plans to continue the search for their remains?
Right. So from the Vietnam War, so from Southeast Asia, there are 1,585 yet unaccounted for. So within that number, and that are specific to Vietnam, I believe it's around 400 that of individuals who are deemed non-recoverable for a specific set of reasons.
But specifically, you refer to somebody whose helicopter crashed at sea and he's several thousand feet underwater.
That's exactly right. So that's the example of Dwayne Swoolier from Redcliffe and from this little post. In all likelihood, he will not be recovered because his remains, at least at this point, and with the technology, the capabilities of underwater archaeology, are not strong enough to be able to resolve that. Yeah. So the U.S. military, the government is dedicated to accounting for its missing in action. I think what gets harder and harder for Vietnam is that it depends on recovery, right? So of those 1,585 of the last year, there's only from, I think it's July 2019, there's only been one identification. Now, of course, we have to understand the context that COVID-19 has pretty much ground to a halt recovery missions in the region. Right? So there's very little that can be done, at least U.S. military seeking to locate sites and identify. So there may be what they call unilateral turnovers. So it might be that remains are recovered and given to the Vietnamese government. The Vietnamese government then brings it and gives it to the U.S. But right now, it's that process is slow, if not entirely stymied, because of COVID and because the challenges after so many years of going over and over investigating various different cases. There's not as many remains to be recovered, like that can be recovered, and that's hard. That's hard for family members who think about their own lives and want desperately to be able to bury their loved one, to welcome him home, like I described for Merlin Ray Allen, before they themselves die. And that's a very real and painful reality for a lot of the Vietnam families.
But it seems to me, and was new to me, that the search and identification process has now widened out to other wars.
Correct.
Where World War II, enormous cemeteries in the Pacific where Americans were buried, enormous cemeteries. And what is going with that?
Yeah, so I think part of this is the challenge. You know, we've talked about the science and the extraordinary change that, say, forensic genetics can lead to, but it also means that expectations are much higher. And then, you know, congressional oversight says, okay, there's a significant budget to recover remains, and you've got the tools. So this needs to get more efficient. And since the remains aren't, you know, coming at rapidly, and in fact, the chances are diminishing from Vietnam, what you have is the government saying, well, we can account for, and we have the possibility with unknowns. So, unknowns buried in national military cemeteries for the Korean War and for World War II, including the Pearl Harbor attacks. So, USS Oklahoma. That's one example where it's ongoing, but there's been an extraordinary
That's
effort.
the one that went turned over and the bodies are still inside, and it's a memorial in and of itself.
Well, so that's the Arizona, that's the memorial
I'm
itself,
sorry.
exactly. But the Oklahoma, you had remains recovered and buried at what's called the Punch Bowl, the National Military Cemetery of the Pacific. And there, in 2015, the Defense Department began a concerted program to disinter unknowns. And that process is painstaking, slow, because there's a reason why these individuals are unknown and unidentified. And it's not for the lack of care or for the attempts in the 1950s, so that's predominantly when that happened. It's because there's a lot of what we call commingling. So you may have multiple individuals in one coffin, or you know, parts of skeletons in one coffin. And so again, we have this idea that you bring up the coffin, there's a complete skeleton, you test, you know, with DNA, and it's done. And in fact, you know, if nothing else, we can acknowledge from war that it's incredibly destructive, it's messy, and you know, not being able to identify has much to do with the conditions of the destruction of the body. And so that's what we're seeing with these unknowns. It's taking time. They're making fantastic progress, but it's taking time.
All right, let's wrap. We need to wrap sort of a little bit. We have about 3 minutes to go, but I'm going to let you talk. Once I read another part of your book, which is a poem written by one of the more active people in the MIA community, about Mary Defoe, a classmate of Woodsy Soulier, one of the men we were talking about. She said, this is the beginning, May 1967, I wrote a poem. I said, no, you are not dead. You are not. You are too young. I am too young. Death is not real. I didn't really know that I would never see you again. That you would never come home to this place. I thought nobody equals no death. So maybe you'll come back. That's the emotional side of it. And the other thing is the Vietnam War in particular, I think, involved a level of distrust, between the soldiers and the government they worked for, as discovered recently, are pretty reasonable because the President Nixon had made a deal to keep the war going. But that's another question. But a level of distrust that between the nation, the soldiers felt disrespected. Talk about the future. Talk about what can be what can be addressed about the Vietnam soldiers and all the soldiers, and what can be done in the future.
Yeah, I know we just have a minute or so left, and I want to say just how grateful I am to Mary Defoe for sharing that poem. Mary herself lost her husband, I believe, in 2013. I think that's right. And he died of lung cancer, but she would also say, and she has written, that he, maybe more so, he died of PTSD. So her husband had also served in Vietnam. And one of the things that I think Mary has taught me as the vets at the VFW post is, you know, that this has been a long, slow process to grapple with the wounds of this war, and it's taken a long time for not their communities. Like, I think this is an extraordinarily supportive community, but you know, being invited into that national sort of the rituals of remembrance at Vietnam, that service, that that it wasn't recognized in the same way, right? When they came home, there wasn't that showered with praise, right? But this
No
was
ticker tape parades.
right. So this was a contested war, and I would say a lot of the veterans have they waited a long time to feel welcomed. And the final chapter I write about is kind of acknowledging how families and veterans have taken memory matters into their own hands, and they're grateful for communities and the nation recognizing it. But this is much of that work they've had to do themselves, and yeah. So I think when they hear "Welcome Home" now, they say it to one another, right? "Welcome home, brother," and they're acknowledging maybe what was not said to them so many years ago.
Okay, as I say, I thoroughly recommend the book. There's another question here, but I think we need to go back to something technical. Thank you very much. I appreciate reading it and talking to you about it. And thank you for the people at George Mason that put this together.
Yes, I echo that. And thank you, Terry. I really appreciate the close read you gave us.